Most people don't think of strategy that way.
Developing a new strategy.
Strategic blind spots.
When strategy meets reality.
Strategy and innovation.
In the strategy world.
Drive their strategic goals.
And welcome back to Strategy Meets Reality podcast. Welcome back to Strategy Meets Reality podcast. I'm delighted today to be joined by Erik Schön. I've been a long fan of your work, especially your Medium post, which I'll put up on the show notes. Please, before we jump into that, welcome Erik. If you don't mind giving us a bit of background and a bit of context about yourself for our guests.
Sure, thanks, Mike. Happy to be here. Always delighted talking about strategy. It's my favorite topic. So I'm Erik Schön. I'm a practitioner, so I've been doing strategy since the 90s in various roles. You know, startups, scale-ups, incumbents, internet startups, incumbents like Ericsson. But I'm also a reflective practitioner because I wrote a book about it. You know, I've been thinking about it. I've been doing it over the past 20, 25 years. And I got this insight. Well, Sun Tzu, John Boyd, Simon Wardley, they're onto something. They are speaking the same language, using different words, if you will. So yeah, I wrote this book, started as Medium posts, it's all free. Then one of my colleagues in London said, well, I can't read Medium on the tube. So could you turn it into a PDF? And then when I turned it into a PDF, I thought, well, I could just turn it into a real book that could be printed. Well, that's what I did. It was during the pandemic. So I saved a couple of hours commuting.
That's great. And yeah, I love the way you bring the works together. And I think we have a similar passion for Boyd and Sun Tzu. Where we slightly deviate is on Wardley, not because I don't like his work. It's like with anything you don't get. And he is on my top of my list there, the top three things that I need to get my head around, because I love the way that he visualizes things. And I think that's really important. You said something in your introduction that strikes me and I think is lost a lot. You said you're a practitioner and you do strategy. And I think that's the thing I've been wrestling with for a long time, is that I think since the days of Sun Tzu, we went through the transition phase where strategy became no longer an act of being, an act of doing, and it became more of an output. We're just chasing an output. Do you see that as well?
Absolutely. It is a process. It's an ongoing thing. It's not an artifact. So you're absolutely correct. Doing it continuously or regularly is key. And, you know, a lot of big companies, they have their 5-year plans or 5-year strategies, and they do it once a year at most. So yeah, that's not really the world we live in, because it really starts with the environment. And if the environment is volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous, then you need to adapt. It's like water. I love the way Sun Tzu uses water metaphors. I mean, if the world is in constant motion, then you need to be able to adapt, and not only adapt, you need to shape. And water is good at both adapting, you know, following the hillsides, but also shaping the hillsides. So I think that's what Sun Tzu and a lot of people in what's now called China got right. They started from the premise, the world is in constant motion. How do we thrive in such an environment?
Yeah. And I think that's that static point, even when, you know, people are going through these strategy cycles. By the time they've looked at a year, there's so much context missing. And there's so much, like, people forget what was the conversation, what were we thinking about, what was the real challenge at this point. And it needs to be that consistent conversation, the consistent act of observing, you know, looking at the terrain, which I see if anyone looks at your Medium post, they'll see a very clear, really good image that you created based off of Wardley. And what I really like in there, because you have observation at the start, and I think that's something that, you know, what I've seen from organizations not very good at. They want to go straight to solution without understanding the context first. But the next part of that is the terrain. And I don't think people appreciate, I know we're not like, you know, military or Sun Tzu, where they had a physical terrain that they were looking at the constraints of that. But even businesses, we still have a terrain. It's external environment. I just don't think we appreciate it that way.
Absolutely. And in a military context, you would use maps, right, to orient yourself. And reality always has precedence, but you need the maps to sort of be able to have a dialogue, to have a conversation. What does the terrain look like? And you can look at it together in your team and then start to orient orient yourself and take action or discuss what actions to take and make decisions about different choices of direction and whatnot. And that's the beauty of Simon Wardley's work, and that's how it connects, because he visualizes the business landscape, how businesses evolves, how technology evolves, and then you can start to have those kind of conversations together in your team or prepare on your own to get your thoughts down on paper, because currently there's so much narratives going on, there's so much storytelling, and well, that's rhetorics. If you go back to the old Greeks, I mean, you need to have some thought behind it and some analysis and some synthesis behind that, and that if you have a map, if you're lost in the forest, or if you're planning your campaign, you need something similar in business and in tech, and that's the beauty of Simon Wardley and his Wardley Maps.
Yeah, you must model the external environment some way, because otherwise strategy becomes this abstract thing. And I think for a long time, and I think that's what deters people away from strategy, because they see it as this abstract task. And they're like, oh, I'm more of a doer. I don't, but actually it's not, you know, it is about a way of being. Sensing oriented is a very doing activity, but because we're not using tools like Simon Wardley or trying to visualize the map, it does become abstract. And humans, when we live in the abstract space, we're very good at building our own friction, because I just assume that you're talking about something that I recognize, but you're not. And it just builds and builds friction, and we don't really get to effectively orientate.
Absolutely, I fully agree. And that's, I mean, people are different, right? So some people, they like the action, the concrete. Others, they like the abstract, you know, the strategizing, whatever that means.
Yeah.
But strategizing, it's both thinking, discussing, and doing. You need to have all these things. Otherwise, it just won't work. It's like a system. So then you need all those capabilities in there. And you're right that the people who like action, but presumably they would like to take the right action, do the right thing.
Yeah.
And this will help them do the right thing. And it will help them to contribute to their whatever team they're in, or whatever organization they're in, if it's a corporate, if it's NGO, or even your sports team. So it really, really helps.
And I love the fact that, like me, I found recently, like modern strategy stuff, it's just, I buy books. I got loads of books, like most of them are part read, because I get through them and I think, well, there's nothing really new. But then I look back, I spend more time looking back at people like Boyd, Sun Tzu, and all that, and Clausewitz, and because it amazes me how we've conceived the idea that we are more volatile, more complex than ever. Maybe partly true, but we're somehow different to what it was like. But those figures back then, they were talking about the very skills, the very way of thinking that we needed to deal with this complexity, and we forgot those lessons. And it's almost we're trying to create new ones, but you don't need to.
True, very true. And I've been thinking about this as well when writing the book and reflecting, because I read pretty much every translation there is on Sun Tzu, so I don't speak Chinese, but I try to interpret it and read it with modern glasses to have that perspective. What about using this in a modern context, modern conflict, modern strategy to succeed in turbulent times, sustainably succeed in turbulent times? And the insight is that when, at the time, what is now called China, it wasn't even China, it was the warring states period. It was hundreds of years of wars. You know, we think we're in turbulent times now, but, you know, hundreds of years of wars forming basically a continent. And they had not one pandemic, they had several pandemics. And there was social upheaval, there were revolutions going on for hundreds of years. I mean, if that isn't volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous, it's X or a X. So they were absolutely in flux.
Yeah. And there came the skill. So if you were to advise someone that was fresh to Sun Tzu, either, I know the classic is The Art of War. Is there anywhere else also? What's some of the key principles that you think really stand out for Sun Tzu?
Now, the couple of things in Sun Tzu, he talks about these, I call them correlative pairs. There's loads of translations of it, but it's really the yin and yang. I mean, everyone heard about yin and yang, but it's very superficial. But if you go back to the Chinese language, it's pictures, right? It's pictograms. And yin and yang, that's like the sunny side of the mountain and the shady side of the mountain. So it means that throughout the day, the mountain will be shady and it will be sunny. There are things that move, there are things that change. So it's yin and yang. It sounds very abstract, very fluffy. But if you look at the sign, and people who read Japanese and Chinese, they will see this. It's the sunny side of the mountain, it's the shady side. So they get that image by reading it. So where am I going with all this? Well, there's a number of those correlative pairs in Sun Tzu, and that's like his, or whatever, if it was one person or whoever collective wrote the book. I mean, it's their way of making sense of the context and the patterns of this volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous world. So they have these pairs that they try to map the context and the current situation into. So should we attack or should we defend? And one of the key correlative pairs is expected and surprise. So what is expected and what is a surprise? And Boyd riffs on this a lot as well, and as do Simon Wardley. In the military, of course, you want to trick your opponent and you want to have this strategic ambiguity so they don't know what to expect. You want to get into their observe, orient, decide, act loop. And that you can do with shaping and deception and whatnot. But the essence is that this cycle of expected and surprise, that's a key strategic, call it a principle, but it's part of this toolbox with correlative pairs. And expected and surprise, take a modern example. My favorite one is probably Apple. The launch of the iPhone. I watched the Rim Blackberry movie the other night. I can thoroughly recommend it.
Yeah, I watched that, yeah.
It's a fantastic movie. And they are so successful with the keyboard and everything. And then they're in shock when Steve Jobs is on stage. Text, iPod, web. Text, iPod, web. That's expected, right? You want to have that. But then it's in the one device. And it's totally surprising, and the user interface is awesome. You have desire to use. So that's like a great illustration of the combination. You have the expected, and then you give this knockout punch, the surprise. It's in one device.
Yeah.
So that's a concrete example of applying that principle today.
Yeah, and I think that you see it enough, really. And I watched that Blackberry, and it's a Blackberry film on Netflix. If you haven't watched it, I would recommend people watch it. It's a really good example about how someone becomes quite disconnected with the external environment. And even thinking about in John Boyd terms, their orientation is locked in. It's not keeping up with reality. And so they deny all information. They were denying that, oh yeah, we don't need that. We're still good. Everyone still wants what we've got. And unfortunately, that led to their demise. This whole idea of surprise, we used to do it in the military, and it was all about, yes, there's stuff that they knew that we would do standard, but then we'd always find two key things: security and surprise. We always make sure we had security, and we always make sure we had surprise. And because if you can surprise someone, then they're trying to reorientate really quickly. And if you get them in that space where they're in complete shock and awe, and they are trying to make sense of what you're doing, that puts them sort of on the back foot, and that's what you want. You want to seize that initiative.
Exactly. And to translate that into business, because there you have customers, right? And you don't want to negatively surprise them. You want to positively surprise them. You want to say, oh, this is awesome. So they have a desire to use what you just positively surprised them with. So that's essential. But then, of course, you have competition and your competitors. You want to give them a surprise or two that, oh, what happened there? I'm totally lost. Where did that come from? That works with your competitors in business as well. And one thing we did in Ericsson, I don't think it's a secret anymore, but it's on a far less grand scale than Apple. But we had releases twice a year, telecom software for mobile networks. And we always wanted to have at least one thing, or maybe only one thing, that was this positively surprising that, well, our customers, the operator, would say, wow, we really need to have that. And it would also leave our competitors in shock because ideally they couldn't do it in a year or two. So we always aim to have one of those sort of awesome desire to use kind of features in our releases twice a year. So and of course we had a lot of other features as well, but those were the expected ones. You need to have the table stakes as well, but then at least, or at most, one such compelling need to have kind of feature.
And I have this discussion with clients when we're doing strategy with them, and I'll say there are some stuff that you want to externalize and you want to say. There are stuff that we don't want to say, and actually it's okay. But I think for a long time, we're used to this artifact of strategy where we put up our purpose and vision and all this lot. But actually, there's some stuff we want to deceive people for reasons, for security, so that we can shock them. And if we can shock them, it gives us that advantage. And we should always be, sensing, reorientating, adapting to the environment to our advantage, whatever the advantage means in that context. But I don't know. I look back sometimes and I think, how have we lost these skills? I know I'm not saying we all have, there are plenty of people out there that have them, but we generally in the sort of MBA exec world, I just don't really think this sort of ideas exist.
Yeah, I mean, conflict, competition, these things are tricky, right? It's not like you take a simple formula and just follow the simple rules and fill in the blanks of a form. It's not that simple. You need to think, you need to observe, you need to discuss, you need to visualize. It takes a lot of time and effort. And most people, even managers, executives, they haven't really done it. They haven't really practiced. They haven't trained for it. And of course, they're a bit lost when they're told to, could you come up with a strategy? And of course, we're humans, so we want to use as little energy as possible to get quick to target, and that's it's not good. It won't give you a good strategy. But the thing is, and coming back to Boyd, as long as you're slightly less bad than your competitors, it's okay. So that's why a lot of the sloppy strategy work still works, because your competitors are even worse.
Yeah. And I think people underestimate this idea of structural coupling or shaping. Is I wrote about that the fact is the buoyancy of the market that is dragging them through, not necessarily their conscious effort to position themselves in that way. Because you even look at we were talking about surprise. You look at Apple now. Apple, as we said earlier, with Steve Jobs, he had that. He had that ability to shock, awe, and surprise. And now it's almost like we wait for the new iPhone, and it's like, oh wow, it's a different color, nice one. They've lost the ability to do that, and I think that's why they're now so tightly bound in a herd. I don't think they know how to get themselves out and distinguish themselves differently.
Exactly. So instead of having this cycle of expected surprise, they're like expected, that was expected. There's no positive surprise.
No.
That's a bit of a problem.
And I often laugh when I look back on Sun Tzu's work. And I said, imagine if it was like now in Sun Tzu's time, where like they're looking and they then come up with ideas, but they spend most of their time on slates drawing graphs about the expected benefits of their strategy and all this stuff, sat on a hillside doing that and presenting that to a board of people to get approval. Whilst all that's happening, the enemy is shifting around. Well, technically that did happen in Napoleon's time.
No, but what they did, and this is in the book and in my interpretation, what they did was they did some kind of simulations. So they were doing, let's call it wargaming as preparations. So they were talking about, sticks and calculations in the temple. But that means they had a mission room where they simulated, and they looked at their capabilities, they looked at their strengths and weaknesses and prepared. How are we going to shape based on the environment? And they were trying to set up conditions in those preparation sessions so that they would be certain to win. I mean, create the conditions so that the consequence would be sustainable success. So they were doing a lot of planning and preparations and checking their capabilities. And to avoid a conflict, that was the best, because then you didn't sacrifice a lot of people and a lot of land and a lot of valuables and money and whatnot. So if you could win without even having a conflict, that was the best. And alliances were super important. So there's a hierarchy of things, a priority list of things to do. And at the bottom was going all in conflict and
you still see that exist today in the form. I don't think people look at it the same way, but the idea of shaping or being shaped, how do you consciously shape the conditions to your advantage? And that's looking at what constraints in play, what couplings you have, so alliances, suppliers. If you can shape yourself in that way, then you don't have to go into conflict. You will win, you sustain that advantage. But that simulation is overrated. Underrated, sorry, not rated, underrated. I'm used to it in the military. We do it all the time. And you only have to look at the success of, you don't have to agree with what they were doing, but that operation in Venezuela with the Delta Force, prior to that, they would have done loads and loads of simulation, war gaming through that to try and to shape the conditions best for them to make sure that their success had a higher percentage than it would be if they just boldly went, oh, let's just go in and let's see what happens.
Absolutely. And in those simulations, I mean, in China at the time, they didn't even have maps. Maps were invented later, right?
Yeah.
So, and that's why using a Wardley map to sort of simulate or look at various potential happenings and how can we shape, where do we put in the conditions here, what capabilities do we have, what capabilities do we outsource, or what can we buy, what can we build ourselves, those kind of things. So you can map this shifting landscapes. It's basically just a graph of capabilities and how they depend upon each other. And then you look at the evolution from something completely new, a novelty, to a complete commodity, like electricity or tap water. And all things in life and the world evolves through those phases. So that will help you tremendously to prepare. And then, of course, everything about agility, flexibility, that's all good.
Yeah.
But you need to know where you're heading and try to shift the odds a bit in your favor. And that you do through a little bit of preparation and looking at your capabilities, looking at your customers, starting from the customer and customer needs, both the expressed ones and the sort of not yet expressed ones. So, and then you work your way all the way down to whatever you need, what capabilities, including electricity, because you need to run your data center somehow.
But you mentioned a key word quite a few times now, is capability. It's the matching of the external environment. Where do we need to position ourselves best to have that advantage? But then also that's that connection. And I think that connection between the internal and external gets missed sometimes. You go, well, if we are to do that, we need these capabilities and these resources to enable us to do that. Now, is that achievable?
Sure. I'm getting excited here because in Ericsson, that's a telecom company, mobile networks with radios and stuff. So we always talked about line of sight to customer. Line of sight is good because if you have line of sight, that means you have good radio conditions and you don't have any interference and stuff. So that metaphor was extremely valuable when talking to engineers and managers and whoever in the company, because everyone got the metaphor. We want to have clear line of sight to customer. And if you don't have that, if you have the sort of a foggy view or no view at all, then you run the risk of going totally wrong. So how do we get clear line of sight to customer? That could help us with all the tricky trade-offs, coming back to the Sun Tzu correlative pairs. Should we be on this end of the spectrum or that end of the spectrum? And of course that shifts. It's a timely balance. The balance is different in different contexts and different situations. But if you can take the customer perspective to it, that will help you to reduce all these, tens of trade-offs or hundreds of trade-offs to the few key ones that you really need to grapple with and resolve to the best of your abilities. But then to have this map of capabilities with a clear line of sight to the customer and his or her needs, then you can identify gaps. We don't have this capability. Okay, how do we get that? Do we build it ourselves? Do we buy it? Or do we outsource it? So it can help you with those kind of decisions. Because you have this map that you draw together in your team, and then you can start challenge what's on the map rather than challenge each other, which typically happens in a corporate environment. It turns into a rhetorics game, me versus you. And instead, how do we improve this map or our understanding of or our orientation of the environment, the current environment together? That's the beauty of it.
And that takes, I don't know, there's loads of leadership literature that talks about this, about self-awareness, but there's that self-awareness of the organization that I think gets overlooked, in that a real deep understanding of your identity as an organization. What actual capabilities do you have is really important. And I think this gets clouded by aspiration, in a sense of, I'm not talking about no ambition, but I'm talking about, it's great to have ambition, but we need to start with reality first. Who are we? What capabilities do we currently have? Because then when we're mapping it, like you said, it's easier for us to understand where our gaps are, other than when they live in this fanciful world and they go, oh yeah, but we're really good at that. or we're going to be this. And I have to often sometimes go, don't talk about what you want. Let's talk about what you are first, the current state first.
Yeah, and that's the beauty of Boyd's orientation, and that you can do on an individual level, you can do it on a team level, you can do it on an organization level, or even on a society level. So it's fractal, right? The key thing is you do it. I mean, as a human being, you do this observation orientation. It's like simultaneously. It just goes on and on, and sometimes you apply more energy, and sometimes you're more on autopilot. But having this regularly done in your team or in your organization, and then it's different time scales. And if you've done it once a year for strategy, then maybe you should do it quarterly. That's what we tried in Ericsson. We moved it from annual cycles to quarterly cycles, and then we called it strategy retrospectives and prospectives, because it was like, take a day, the whole leadership team, really think together and visualize, where are we, what have we done, what have we learned, and then look towards the next quarter. And it was really not about, KPIs and targets. It was what have we learned and what capabilities are working for us and which ones are not working for us. So like compressing the cycle a bit to learn faster. That was the aim in that specific context.
Yeah, I think it grounds you more in the context, having that space to observe, orientate. And again, it's not a balance scorecard, it's not a KPI, because I think that blinds people into trying fixing a measure rather than broadening it out to go, what's happening? How is the external environment shifting? Is it to our advantage or not? What's shaping us? How can we? And I think this is a more broader questions that then make sense when we then go more granular into, okay, so what capabilities do we need? Where do we need to probe to see if we do? Where's the simultaneous experiments that we need to run? It becomes a lot clearer. But I think if we create this, what I call self-induced ambiguity, strategic ambiguity is really good and we can get onto that. But when we get that self-induced ambiguity, we create so much fog that no one can really see what we're going through. It just creates confusion, and people will then become so internal in their functions that they just fracture.
Absolutely. And this thing about ambiguity and fog, I mean, we like to have clarity. The clarity, as you rightly point out in one of your latest blog posts, is not about details.
Yeah.
It's rather the opposite. You need to get clarity on the direction first. And if you lock down too much on specific KPIs and you lock them for 12 months, you will miss out on opportunities that come up if you're not open. And that's why this conditions consequences approach, that's like Sun Tzu and Lao Tzu, they're not locking into a specific target. They're looking at the direction, and then they are flexible as you go, because the map maybe it was wrong. And you find things out, and then you need to be flexible. But yeah, you avoid getting, because some people are so focused, results focused, and they're so action oriented. So then they will get into this tunnel vision and miss out on what's going on in reality outside their little tunnel. And that's not good in a competitive environment.
No. Yeah, in any environment, you see it in our NHS and stuff like that here, our public services. They're not in a competitive environment, but what they do is they just get so focused on targets. And I know it's the pressure from the government to set these targets, but it really narrows their focus. And then they try to seek stability and predictability by saying, if we do this, we will get this. And that's what they aim for, and they miss all the changes, rather than going, well, what's the intent? What's the direction? Or, how do we hold the intent firmly, but the direction or the plans loosely? It gives us that flex to adapt.
Yeah, that's a very interesting observation, because if you go back to 2,500 years ago, it was about going to the Gemba, being in the environment and seeing with your own eyes, not steering through KPIs, because then you try to abstract away reality. Yes. You try to abstract away the context. You try, but you may go horribly wrong because you're not there. in reality. And again, coming back to these Chinese characters, the character for Gemba, I think I looked it up sometime. It's like the original meaning was something like the emperor looking out at the rice fields and people are starving. I mean, that's a pretty interesting graphical representation of why it's important with the Gemba and be there and see what's going on and not sitting in your castle or palace and steer through KPIs.
Yeah. Because you're blind. A lot of them are purely. I wouldn't call it retrospective. It's just purely looking backwards for these KPIs, trying to justify the score rather than really going, well, what's capability are we missing? What's changed now that's making it difficult for us to achieve this? And it's more having a better conversation about the internal and the external.
Exactly. And we were coming from a situation where we used the balanced scorecard for quite a long time in Ericsson and a lot of engineers there. So we got into all these complex calculations and formulas in Excel. So we lost, I mean, we didn't see the forest for the trees. We got bogged down in all those details. It's like, no. We're going to try something radically different here. And that's what we did. Going from those Excel sheets to retrospectives and prospectives on what is really important right now and try to define what's the most important thing for us? What's the biggest problem? What's the biggest challenge for us as an organization right now? And let's focus on that for the coming quarter and ask the whole organization to think, how can we contribute? What can I do in my part of the organization? What can we do in our team? So it's a subtle shift, because traditionally you have your overall objective and you break it down and you break it down and you break it down and you lose the line of sight. But here it was like, okay, this is the overall challenge for our organization for the coming quarter. How can I and we contribute? And then you started to get a lot of actions, a lot of very sensible actions, because people knew what was most important and everyone was thinking, what can we do? That was pretty amazing, actually.
And it's good because it's the principles of mission command, isn't it? From
exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
This is the intent. This is what I want to achieve, and this is what we sort of deem success will look like, i.e., the outcome that we should visibly see. And then is a case of right, what R&D function. What does that mean to you? And they'll simulate that and go, well, what's the context? What are they actually asking me to do? And they'll come up with ideas and they'll run those ideas. But that's where really got to be key around when we look at strategy, we look at manoeuvres and we say, right, like we're going to do these manoeuvres, which should hopefully change the trajectory to our advantage. But each maneuver is activity, is capability. It's something happening in the organization. It isn't just an abstract thought that we're not doing anything. And I will say that there's a outcome and output measure. So output is something physically that we're going to do. And then outcome is the culmination of those. We should see, and I use see purposefully because in the external environment we look out, we should see this change in the dynamics. We should see, a competitor retreating on these areas. We see stronger relationship in this alliance we've created. We see that the customers are reacting in this way. But that's the bit that really makes sense to what we're doing. And we're not seeing that emerge. Then something else has happened and we can look and go, well, what has emerged or what hasn't emerged? And how do we then adapt from this stance?
Absolutely. And to me, what you're saying means that everyone needs to think for him or herself. They need to think a bit and reflect. Okay, it's not just mindless execution of someone else's orders, if you will. Every team, every individual needs to think and act based on the context and the why. So and that's pretty powerful. And that also, then you need to look at the results to have this feedback and learning loop as well, as you rightly point out with the output and the outcome. And then you need to think of, okay, how do we measure this? And it's not someone else putting a measure on you. It's you who you do an experiment and you need to think about how you measure the outcomes or the outputs from it. And no one else but you can do that, or your team, or your part of the organization.
Exactly. And what we're explaining there takes a great bit of agility, because I'll see people listen to this and they'll probably go, well, it's pretty tough because we're solid out just delivering. And it's because they don't have that requisite agility in there, that bit of flex that can deal with this today and tomorrow tension that's going on, this change versus status quo. And that's where it goes down, because I think we've been locked into efficiency. And if you look back on Sun Tzu and all those back in battle, you imagine if they were going, well, actually, why have we got 3 people here where we could probably have, one person doing this, and that'll save us some money.
Yeah, and I think what we did successfully in Ericsson was we had the business person, the head of the product management, and the R&D person, head of the product development unit. They shook hands on stage, say, "Hey, we're going to work together." Which was not always the case, a little bit of politics going on in large organization, me versus you, or R&D versus business, IT versus the business. But they were on stage and, hey, we're going to do this together. And they did a few things that were really important. That was one, very symbolic, but also very concrete. They also said that we would like you to invest not 1%, not 5%. I think they said 10% of your time on improvement work. If they would have said 5% or 1%, it would have been 0. But I think I'd have to check if they said 10% or 20%. They may even have said 20%, just to make, the surprise. Percent, wow. Because they knew that there would be pressure on delivering, right? So they said that, and both of them said that. They had just been shaking hands on stage. And then people started to do these improvement experiments. And they said that, okay, you're going to put so and so much out, one day per week. Or I think we had, what did we call it? Did we call it an innovation day or improvements day? We had it once per sprint. Sprints were they 2 weeks or 3 weeks? So 1 day per sprint allocated for this. Then you could not only think, but also do whatever software coding or scripts and stuff. And they also pushed us and said that, well, you should get the return on investment, not in 2 years, not in 1 year, but let's try to do it in a quarter.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
And that was driving small experiments.
Yes.
Because if you do a small thing, then you will get the return of investment quickly because you just invested a little. So it doesn't take so much. So it was a number of brilliant steps there that we did. And I'm not saying this is easy. This was a journey. We started around 2008, more than 5 years, less than 10 years. It takes time and effort.
Yeah. You essentially bring in a paradigm shift of how, we've been ingrained to sort of think from the sort of, Taylorism of efficiency all the way through. And I really like the idea of the small experiments, because I see it in large organizations, especially in our public services, where if they've got an idea or a change, it's a transformation. It's like everyone's doing it all at once. And you're thinking, well, that's just, you're overwhelming and destabilizing your whole organization. Where actually you can, because everything's fractal and you've got teams, actually you can isolate that and go, well, let's run the experiment just in these 2 teams in these 2 different areas and see what happens. We can learn from that. And then that means we can move forward. I think there's an urge it's almost like a false sense of speed, thinking that we should do it all at once, it was just done quicker. And they wonder why I won't say they fail, but it's very suboptimal results.
Yeah, it's so interesting because our whole paradigm in the Northwestern world since the Greeks has been like, change is hard. Change is, we don't want that. We want stability. Whereas the Eastern world, China, Japan, Southeast Asia, they start from the opposite. Change is natural. Change is easy. Just do it. How hard can it be?
Yeah.
That's the nature. And you do small things, small improvements, small trials. And they even have symbols for change. The dragon, that's the ultimate shapeshifter. That's the hero in Eastern mythology. And you have things like, even today, you have one of the baseball teams in Japan, they're called the Hiroshima Carps. Why do they pick a carp? Well, because the carp is like the symbolic animal that fights up through the rivers up to the very top. And when it has fought its way through, it becomes the dragon. Wow. This interesting how societies over centuries can see change in totally different ways.
Yeah. Change is natural because we are, like I said earlier, we're structurally coupled to the external environment. So changes in that change us. We only look back on us society in the last sort of 100 years, the amount of changes we've come through, not all by, we haven't opted and gone, I'm going to do this. It's by the nature of things changing in the environment that has changed us. We do it and we adapt. That's the whole nature of our evolutionary species. But it seems to come to organizations and they fight this idea. They want this stability, this efficiency, this perceived predictability, where actually if they just embrace it and they realize that adaptation is crucial. The viability principle we live by in sort of systems world is that you must adapt as quick as or quicker than your external environment or your competitors have, otherwise you'll cease to exist. But it's how do we constantly adapt without losing our identity? And I think that what happens is that organizations don't do that. So they wait and they wait and they wait until they have to transform. And I think that's where they create such instability, and sometimes people don't make it the other way and their identity completely collapses.
It's a paradox because as individuals, we're extremely adaptable. Think what people have been going throughout history on an individual level or on a family level. I mean, it's amazing. But as you say, when it comes to the organizational level, it's almost like a bit of the opposite, except for some organizations that have that capability sort of built in because they've been around for hundreds of years. That's in their DNA that, well, we're good at changing and adapting, and we've been around since the 1300s or 1400s. So then they have that in their identity.
Yeah. You see some great examples of companies that do it recently. Like you think of things like Netflix. They went from Love DVD and they've adapted now to, they're not even a content provider anymore. They're a content creator, and they've done those adaptations over time. They didn't go, we're going to be this. It was a linear path. They chose opportunities, and those opportunities or affordances, and those provided opportunities. They took those, and over time, their identity, they're adapted. Same with Nvidia. They started off as, cards for games, graphics cards for games. Now they are the backbone of AI, and they've gone from a 30 billion valuation to 4 trillion. So, adaptation does bring reward.
Absolutely. Those are great examples. And they have built capabilities along the way. And they have been shaped their environment to make it more probable for them to succeed. So they've been both adaptable, they've been flexible, and they've been thinking very deeply about who they want to be and where they want to go and what the environment, looking at their strengths, looking at their weaknesses, looking where the environment is going. With Netflix, I like this idea of looking at the local content creation. That's their surprise, I think, that you can have murder mysteries in Sweden that's not only for Sweden and for the Nordics, it's for a global market. And they made it work. So that's like, wow, no one thought of that before, but they consciously built that capability and made it happen.
Some of the biggest successes have been not to the traditional English or American thing. It's been from Japan, from the Nordics, from Germany. And yeah, they've provided that. And I think that ability to cast a net, that's a surprise and a capability that other traditional traitors are thinking, because they're so locked into just America's. Just England, yeah.
And of course, Japan and Sweden and the rest of the world has learned from England and from the US. We were looking up to the way you made movies and TV series, but then something uniquely local was added to make it like surprising. It's like, wow, that's different in a good way. It's not just strange. So I think it's absolutely brilliant.
And I think that's a classic example of boys' orientation. Actually, they changed their orientation. They destroyed the normal orientation that if you wanted great movies, great production, it had to be Hollywood's or maybe England, and actually destroyed that thing. Actually, no, you can do it. You can do it anywhere. We've got the technology now.
And I think that's the essence of agility, being able to get out of your tracks before you go bankrupt, right? It's that we need to change before you have to create a burning platform. I think that's how do you create that capability in an organization? That's the multi-billion-dollar question.
Yeah. It's always that challenge between status quo and change. And that's always going to be a very, very difficult tension for organizations to to grapple with, especially if they're serving low tolerance for risk, sorry, the stakeholders and boards that like safety. And I think that's, if you think about it now, reflection, I think that's unfortunately where Apple are at the moment, for my estimations, that, they're making a vast amount of money and there's some stakeholders there that don't want that to be disrupted. But then that's a cost of change. And that's why there's no surprise now. It's just the same as we mentioned earlier.
Yeah. Apple is interesting in many ways. They have so many brilliant people and they have such a proud history and they have their identity. Who knows? Maybe they have something.
Yeah.
Maybe they will surprise.
He's going to wait for that surprise. I'm a big Apple fan. Everything I've got is Apple, so I'm waiting for a good surprise.
Same here. But we had some negative surprises recently with some.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, so hopefully they need to reincarnate Steve Jobs to get him out of the situation, or find and unlock that. There will be someone there. It's probably a bit like Clausewitz, von Moltke, when he was general of the Prussian army. The Prussian army were fighting against his ideas to create this adaptable mission command. I won't say the German word because I'm going to embarrass myself. But and they fought against it, and eventually they accepted it, and it brought so much value.
Yeah,
so hopefully there's someone.
Sorry for getting excited, but he created a system, right? He created the whole training and education, and they had their simulations or their war games, and they had this. I forgot the German word. I'm not going to embarrass myself either, even though I speak a little bit of German and I studied in Hamburg, but that was a long time ago. But they had this independent thinking obedience. I love the term. I mean, that's a long German word, independent thinking obedience. And that meant that in those simulations, you had to disobey orders to succeed in some cases.
Yeah.
So Moltke, he put that into the wargaming exercises because he wanted people to think for themselves in the context, not just mindlessly following orders. And the people he took into his general staff were the ones who had actually shown that they could disobey an order in one of those exercises. And I think that's pretty brilliant. And that shows how strongly he believed in the system, that he trusted people. If you have the context and you train together, and then you will think alike, so you can trust each other even more. But it's not like you think the same. That's not what he wanted. He wanted the independent thinking obedience, which is almost like a contradiction in term. You can imagine those stuffy Prussians, right? But they were not. They were totally flexible, and they had an idea of how to do things, and they wanted independent contextual thinking and actions, what the context required.
And it's such a great story to think about. Definitely organizational leaders to think, are they hindering this new capability by their own perceived beliefs and we challenge. But I've thoroughly enjoyed this conversation, and for the listeners there, I'll put Erik's book and Medium post in the show notes so you can really, really get to the root of your thinking, how you synthesized Sun Tzu, Boyd and Wardley together. I think it's fantastic. And I think it'd be really enlightening for listeners. So thank you so much for joining us today, Erik. Before you go though, what would you like to leave listeners to think about from this episode?
I think that it's one of the things that's easy to forget because we're so flexible and adaptable and agile, right? I mean, it's not only about being flexible, adaptable and agile. You can think about how you shape the conditions, how you can create conditions, how you can design things in a way that betters your odds to succeed. I think that's an important takeaway for me from this conversation. I thoroughly enjoyed it. Thank you very much for inviting me.
No, it's a pleasure. Yeah, and I urge people look at this idea of shaping. It is really important. So I think we often just we just go with the flow, and sometimes that can be an advantage, sometimes not. But if you really enjoyed this episode as much as I have, please like and share to your network so that other listeners can enjoy this too. But Erik, thank you so much for coming along, and I look forward to sharing some great ideas again with you soon.
Thank you, Mark. Pleasure.